Hey guys, welcome to my video on speciation. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's begin by understanding what the term species mean. Right, let's start. What is a species? Species are a group of organisms that share similar characteristics and can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. Let's look at the three important points here in this definition. Species, a group of organisms that can do what? Yes, that can share similar characteristics. And what else can they do? Yes, they can interbreed. What else can they do? They are able to produce fertile offspring. Right? So that is what a species is. A group of organisms that share similar characteristics. Number one, they are able to therefore interbreed and they are able to produce fertile offspring. Now, we need to understand this very closely. We are not talking about just mating on its own. We are talking about interbreeding, right? That leads to the production of offspring that can further reproduce. For example, let's say we had two different species, a horse and a donkey. And these two have to mate. Remember, they are two different species. What will the offspring be called? Yes, the offspring is called a mule. Now the mule itself is unable to produce more offspring. So in that case, we say that the mule is infertile. So they have covered two requirements. Number one, having similar characteristics. Number two, being able to interbreed. They have met the requirements for those two aspects, but they did not meet the requirement for this last aspect, which is to produce fertile offspring. But they need to meet all three requirements, right? In order to belong to the same species, right? For example, they must share similar characteristics, meaning they should look more or less similar. They should be able to interbreed. And the offspring that comes from them must also be able to breed thereafter. So that's what we need to look at. With speciation, we refer to the evolution of a new species or the formation of a new species, right? You must be wondering, how does a new species arise from a previously existing one? Well, children, speciation occurs when a population, right, becomes reproductively isolated from other members of the same species, right? They will be isolated from one another, therefore they will be unable to reproduce. Then over time, the two separated populations begin to diverge. They begin to separate in terms of their genes, okay, genetically as well as physically in their physical appearance. Let's take a look at speciation through geographic isolation. This geographic isolation is also known as allopatric speciation, and it's one of the most common forms of speciation. What happens? You will find that a population is geographically separated from one another. Either they are separated by a river, or it could be a mountain, or a desert, etc. If that is the case, if they are separated, you find that the two separated populations now will start to develop in isolation from one another. Because they are isolated from one another now, you will find that no crossbreeding will be allowed to take place because of this geographical barrier. So if there's no crossbreeding, what happens? There will be no gene flow occurring between these two separated populations now. what we will find happening is that there will be different genetic combinations developing in each of these populations. Each population will experience their own genetic mutations, and that will also lead to the production of new alleles within each of these populations. Now we know that different geographical areas are different from each other. Why? In terms of their ecological factors, meaning in terms of their climate, temperature, light, humidity, rainfall, right? They differ in that way in terms of their ecological factors. And because they are facing different ecological factors, different geographical areas also exercise various types of selection pressures on their populations. When we speak about selection pressure, we are talking about the organisms that are better suited to their environment, who will survive the pressure of their selective agents. And what do we refer to this as? Survival of the fittest. Some of the selection pressures faced will be predation, competition, disease. These are all examples of selection pressures. So different geographical areas have different selection pressures on their populations. So what's going to happen in each of these populations? Yes, natural selection will take place in each of these habitats now. What will result is a different gene pool in each of these two populations. What happened? These populations are therefore going to be totally genetically different from one another. Why? Each population now is adapting to its own environment. Do you think crossbreeding is possible now between these two populations? No. Crossbreeding is now impossible because the two populations are now so different from one another genetically, right, that they have become two separate species, right? Two separate species have now been formed. Why? Because they have been geographically isolated from one another. We have seen that each population therefore followed its own evolutionary route and developed separately from one another. Let's take a look at the Galapagos tortoises, right, as an example to show speciation through geographic isolation. They were a population of a single species that was divided by a geographical barrier. So the population of tortoises split up into two groups. Right. What do we expect now? We will expect there to be no gene flow, meaning no reproduction between the two groups. Why? Because they could not interbreed. On each of the islands, the population of the tortoises were different. They showed variation. On one island, the tortoises all had long necks. On the other island, the tortoises all had short necks. In other words, each population were exposed to different environments or different conditions and faced with different selection pressures, and hence they started to undergo natural selection independently, right? They lived under different environmental conditions. They had different sources of food available. So after a period of time, each group of tortoises underwent natural selection independently. And each group then adapts to the new environmental factors and they start to develop separately. On each of the islands, we find that the tortoises had necks suitable for their environment, favorable for its own conditions in order to survive. On one island where the plants were all tall, you find that the tortoises with tall necks survived on that island, while the island that had short plants, you'll find that the tortoises with short necks survived on that island. And this natural selection continued, resulting in each island having tortoises that are very different from each other. They differed genotypically and phenotypically, leading to the formation of a new species. Now, being new species, you'll find that they will be prevented from interbreeding, right? They will become reproductively isolated. They will be prevented from producing fertile offspring if they were one day brought together again. By them being reproductively isolated, you'll find that they will be prevented from interbreeding. Even if they are allowed to mix, each is a separate species. They will be unable to produce fertile offspring.